My name is Clara Millie, and this is my story. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to share a near-death experience, let alone one that would completely alter my view of the world, but here I am. What happened to me was no coincidence, no fluke. It was meant to wake me up and, I believe, to warn others about the times we're living in. It all began on an October night in 2023. The air was crisp, the leaves were crunching underfoot, and I had just come from one of the best evenings of my life, my grandchildren's school play. My grandson Tommy, just 7, played a very convincing talking tree, and my 9-year-old granddaughter, Sarah, was the star of the show as the lead fairy. Watching their faces light up on stage filled me with such pride. The drive home was calm, almost too calm. A light drizzle coated my windshield, the streets were mostly empty, and the dashboard clock blinked at me, 9:47 p.m. I remember turning up the heat in my car and smiling to myself about the way Sarah had twirled on stage. I didn't know that moment of peace would be my last conscious memory. As I reached for the dial, a sudden, excruciating pain shot through my chest. It felt like someone had placed a boulder on me, and I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel instinctively as the car veered off the road, skidding into a ditch. And then everything stopped. I didn't feel fear or confusion. Instead, it was as if I had shed my physical body like an old coat. Suddenly, I was outside of myself, looking down at the wrecked car and my lifeless form slumped in the driver's seat. There was no pain, no struggle, just a strange sense of freedom. The world around me shifted. I was no longer on the side of the road, but in a space that defies explanation. It wasn't earth and it wasn't heaven, not yet. Everything was bathed in light, a light so alive it seemed to hum with energy. Colors surrounded me, vibrant beyond description. Hues that don't even exist here. And then I heard it, "Clara!" The voice was gentle but powerful, as if it carried the weight of galaxies. I turned and saw him, an angel, magnificent and radiant, his presence overwhelming yet comforting. He was nothing like the cherubs you see in paintings. His eyes seemed to hold eternity, and his very being exuded strength and peace. "Fear not," he said, and I instantly felt calm, though I still had no idea what was happening. He reached out his hand, and suddenly we were moving, not walking, not flying, just moving through a corridor of light. Time seemed irrelevant, and yet I knew that what I was being shown was urgent. "What you see," the angel said, "is not just for you. It is for all who will listen." Before me appeared a vision of the earth, but it wasn't like the planet we know. A thick darkness was creeping over it, like a suffocating fog. Yet, scattered across the globe were tiny, radiant points of light. They were small at first, but grew brighter the longer I watched. "These are the faithful," the angel explained. "Those who pray, who worship, who remain steadfast. They are the light that pushes back the darkness." Then, the scene shifted, and I saw churches, beautiful buildings filled with people. But as I looked closer, I realized many of them were simply going through the motions. Their worship was empty, their prayers hollow. "They honor me with their lips," I heard the Lord's voice say, "but their hearts are far from me." Tears filled my eyes, but then something incredible happened. A wave of awakening began to ripple across the earth. It wasn't confined to church walls. It started in living rooms, workplaces, and schools. People were falling to their knees, overwhelmed by the presence of God. "It will not be as it has been before," the angel said. "This awakening is different. It will be sovereign, unstoppable." The vision shifted again. I saw a massive clock, but instead of numbers, it displayed events, wars, natural disasters, moments of great deception. Each one was perfectly timed, unfolding according to God's plan. And then, I saw something that broke me. Countless souls, walking as though in a trance, believing they were saved but had no real relationship with Jesus. They knew of him, but didn't truly know him. "Tell them," The angel said, his voice firm yet sorrowful. "Tell them it is not enough to go through the motions. They must surrender fully." The vision grew darker. I saw persecution rising, not sudden or violent at first, but subtle, almost unnoticeable. Believers were excluded, mocked, and marginalized. Over time, it escalated, and I watched as many fell away, unable to withstand the pressure. But those who remained? Oh, how they shone! They stood firm, their faith unshaken. They carried a mark of protection, a light that the darkness could not overcome. The angel showed me the power of prayer. I saw how each prayer rose like a beam of light, joining with others to form an impenetrable barrier against the darkness. Even the simplest prayers, uttered with faith, carried immense power. Next, I was shown the young, the next generation. They were fearless, unshaken by the lies of the world. They clung to the truth with an intensity that brought others to their knees in repentance. These young warriors would lead a revival unlike anything we've seen. The angel then turned to me and said, "There is more." I was shown families being restored, communities growing in unity, and ordinary people, teachers, nurses, laborers, carrying God's presence into every corner of society. I saw miracles, bodies healed, addictions broken, relationships mended. But I also saw the cost. Faithfulness would require sacrifice. Standing for truth would come with a price, yet those who endured would experience God's power in ways that defied explanation. Finally, I saw the return of Jesus. The sky split open, and his presence was undeniable. Those who had prepared their hearts rejoiced, while others cried out in regret. Suddenly, I was back in my body. The paramedics were stunned. They told me I had been clinically dead for 13 minutes, but here I was, alive and completely unharmed. I know I was brought back for a reason. The message I've shared with you isn't just a story. It's a warning and a call to action. Time is short, shorter than we realize. We must prepare our hearts, know God's voice, and stand firm. The question is, will you be ready when he comes?
In a quiet Nebraska town, the Burpo family's life was turned upside down when their young son, Colton, nearly lost his life during a medical emergency. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. As Colton awoke, he began recounting vivid details of an incredible journey beyond the grave. He spoke of heavenly visions, encounters with angels, and even meeting Jesus himself. But it wasn't just a peaceful glimpse of paradise. Colton returned with a message that left his family and everyone who heard it stunned. A message far more unsettling than they ever could have imagined. This is the story of a boy who returned from death with a terrifying message from heaven. A revelation that challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and what might lie beyond. It was a typical spring day in 2003 in Imperial, Nebraska, a small, close-knit town where everyone knew each other. The Burpo family, made up of Todd, Sonia, their young son Colton, and his sister Cassie, were like many families in the area. They lived a modest life, rooted in faith and community. Todd was a pastor at the local church and also worked several other jobs to make ends meet. He was a volunteer firefighter, a coach, and a handyman. Despite the demanding schedule, Todd was a devoted father and husband. Sonia, a schoolteacher, was equally busy, balancing her career with caring for the children. For the Burpos, life was hectic, but filled with love and a strong sense of purpose. Colton, at just 4 years old, was a lively, energetic child. He was curious and playful, always asking questions about everything he encountered. His blonde hair and wide smile made him instantly endearing to everyone he met. He loved spending time with his family, especially tagging along with his father. Todd often brought Colton with him on errands around town, and they had a close bond. It was clear that Colton admired his father, often imitating him and wanting to be just like him. Life was busy, but good for the Burpo family, until a seemingly minor illness began to change everything. In January of that year, Colton came down with a stomach virus that didn't seem unusual at first. He had been sick with a fever and some stomach pain, which Todd and Sonia assumed was just the flu. But as the days went by, Colton didn't get better. His symptoms worsened, and he began to cry out in pain, clutching his stomach. Sonia became increasingly worried, noticing that his cries were different. They were cries of genuine, excruciating pain. It was unlike anything she had ever heard from her normally tough little boy. Todd and Sonia decided to take Colton to the local family doctor, who examined him but couldn't find anything significantly wrong. The doctor thought it was just a severe case of the stomach flu and advised them to keep Colton hydrated and let it run its course. Todd, trying to keep his family calm, reassured Sonia that everything would be fine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, Colton's condition deteriorated rapidly. His pain became unbearable, and he could barely stand up without screaming. It was as if his small body was being ripped apart from the inside. Sonia called Todd at work in a panic one afternoon, her voice trembling with fear. "Todd, something is wrong. This isn't normal. We need to take him back to the doctor," she said, holding back tears. Todd, feeling a wave of fear he hadn't known before, rushed home. They hurried back to the doctor, who this time could see that Colton's condition was critical. He advised them to take him to the hospital immediately. Todd and Sonia drove as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. Colton lay in the back seat, his face pale, eyes glazed over with pain. It was the longest drive of their lives, filled with silent prayers and a sense of dread they couldn't shake. When they arrived at the Great Plains Regional Medical Center, the emergency team took Colton in immediately. Tests revealed that his appendix had burst, something that the family doctor had missed during the initial examination. A ruptured appendix is a life-threatening emergency, especially for a small child. The toxins released into his body had already begun to spread, causing a severe infection. The doctors told Todd and Sonia that Colton's situation was critical. They needed to operate right away to have any chance of saving him. Sonia burst into tears, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all. One moment, they were dealing with what seemed like a routine stomach bug. The next, they were being told their son's life was hanging by a thread. Todd tried to stay strong for his wife and daughter, but inside, he felt like he was crumbling. He wanted to scream, to beg God to spare his child, but he held back, knowing he had to keep it together for his family. He kissed Colton's forehead before they wheeled him into surgery. "I love you, buddy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Colton, barely conscious, managed a faint smile and said, "I love you too, Daddy." The surgery was intense and lasted much longer than expected. Todd paced the waiting room, unable to sit still. He tried to pray, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he found himself silently pleading with God. Tears streaming down his face as he thought of all the moments he might lose with his son. The games they hadn't played yet, the questions Colton hadn't asked him yet, the dreams they had for his future. He had never felt so helpless. Meanwhile, Colton was undergoing a fight for his life in the operating room. His tiny body had already been weakened by the infection spreading through his abdomen. The surgical team worked frantically, trying to remove the toxins and stabilize him. At one point, his heart rate dropped dangerously low, and they feared they were losing him. It was a moment of sheer terror for the medical team, who fought desperately to keep him alive. As the surgery continued, something incredible happened. Colton, who appeared unconscious on the operating table, later described what he experienced during those critical moments. He claimed that he felt himself leave his body. It was as if he was suddenly floating above the operating table, looking down at the doctors working on him. He could see the frantic movements, the beads of sweat on the surgeon's forehead, and the intense focus on their faces. He watched, detached yet aware, as they struggled to save his life. At the same time, Colton said he could see his parents in the waiting room. He described his mother crying on the phone, speaking to family members, her voice filled with panic. He saw his father in a different corner of the room, pacing back and forth, his head bowed as he prayed. Colton later recounted how he could feel his father's fear and anguish, even though he was physically distant from him. It was an inexplicable experience for a child of 4 to describe with such clarity. When Colton awoke after the surgery, Todd and Sonia were relieved, though exhausted and still deeply worried. They sat by his side, holding his hands, whispering words of love and encouragement. But the relief was mixed with a lingering fear. The doctors couldn't guarantee that Colton was out of the woods. He had been through a life-threatening ordeal, and the risk of complications was still high. In the days following the surgery, as Colton regained his strength, he began to share his experience with his parents. It started innocently enough. He simply mentioned that he had watched them during the surgery. Todd and Sonia exchanged puzzled looks, not sure what he meant. How could he have seen them in the waiting room when he was under anesthesia, fighting for his life? When they pressed him for more details, they were shocked by what he described. Colton knew exactly where they had been standing, what they had been doing, and even snippets of their conversation. He spoke with the matter-of-fact innocence of a child, unaware that what he was saying was impossible. For Todd and Sonia, it was as if the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Their son had been near death, but he was describing events he couldn't possibly have seen or known about. They listened in stunned silence as Colton continued. He described being pulled upward, away from the hospital room, into a place filled with light. He said it felt warm and safe, like nothing he had ever experienced. "I went up to heaven," he said simply, looking at his parents with wide, sincere eyes. Colton's description of heaven began to spill out in bits and pieces over the following days. It wasn't something he sat down to tell as a complete story. Instead, it came up in the most unexpected ways, in the middle of conversations about seemingly ordinary things. Sonia and Todd were trying to navigate the shock and exhaustion of what they had just been through, still processing the reality that they nearly lost their son. They had prayed so hard, clinging to their faith, but hearing Colton talk about his experience felt like stepping into a new reality altogether. One day, while Colton was resting at home, he casually mentioned seeing a man in heaven. "I saw Pop," he said, with the innocent certainty only a child can have. Sonia's breath caught in her throat. "Pop?" she asked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "You mean my dad?" Colton nodded, smiling. "He was really happy to see me," he said. He started to describe the man he had met, the way he looked, his smile, and the warmth in his eyes. The description didn't match any recent photo of Sonia's father that Colton had ever seen. Instead, he described a younger version of the man, with dark hair and a strong build. Todd, listening intently, decided to show Colton an old family photo album. He flipped through it slowly, pointing out pictures of people he thought Colton might recognize. When he got to a faded black and white photo of Pop as a young man, Colton's eyes lit up. "That's him!" he exclaimed. "That's Pop!" Todd and Sonia exchanged a stunned look. Colton had never seen a picture of Pop as a young man. They had only ever shown him pictures from later in life, when he was older and had grey hair. The realization sent a shiver down Sonia's spine. She felt an overwhelming mixture of grief, disbelief, and a strange kind of comfort she couldn't quite put into words. As the days passed, Colton continued to talk about the things he had seen. His descriptions of heaven were simple, but profoundly detailed, filled with imagery that seemed both childlike and otherworldly. He spoke about vibrant colors, unlike anything he had seen before, describing a sky that seemed to glow without a sun. He talked about the music he heard, not just ordinary songs, but a kind of harmony that filled him with a sense of joy and peace beyond what he had ever felt on Earth. He said the light wasn't like the light we have here. It didn't come from one place, but seemed to shine from everything around him. One afternoon, while they were sitting together, Colton mentioned something that left his parents in silent shock. "I met my sister," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Todd and Sonia were puzzled. Cassie, Colton's older sister, was at school. They assumed that's who he was talking about, but Colton shook his head. "No, not Cassie," he explained. "I met my other sister." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Sonia's face went pale, and her eyes filled with tears. She knew instantly what Colton was saying, but it seemed impossible. How could he know? Years before Colton was born, Sonia had suffered a miscarriage. It was a painful experience, one she and Todd rarely spoke about, even to each other. They had never told Colton about it. He was too young to understand, and they didn't want to burden him with the sadness of that loss. Yet here he was, talking about a sister he had never been told existed. Sonia's hands trembled as she asked him gently, what did she look like? Colton's eyes lit up as he described her. "She had dark hair like yours, Mummy," he said. "And she was really, really happy. She hugged me and told me she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven someday." Sonia couldn't hold back her tears. She broke down sobbing, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of emotions. It was as if all the grief she had buried deep inside her heart was being unearthed at once. Todd pulled her into his arms, feeling his own tears welling up. They had mourned that loss quietly, privately, and here was their little boy speaking about it with such certainty, with details he couldn't possibly have known. It felt like a message from beyond. A small glimpse of a life they had lost, but was somehow still there, waiting for them. Colton didn't understand why his parents were crying. To him, it had been a happy reunion. "She said she's okay," he told them earnestly. "She's not sad. She loves you both so much." The words hit Sonia like a physical blow. It was the kind of reassurance she had longed for but never dared to hope for. She realized then that if what Colton was saying was true, it meant that their lost child wasn't really lost. She was safe, happy, and waiting for them in a place filled with love. The revelation changed something in Todd as well. He had been struggling with his own doubts, trying to reconcile his faith with the harsh realities of the world. He had spent countless hours as a pastor comforting others, assuring them of God's love and the promise of heaven. But secretly, he had carried his own fears and uncertainties. Hearing Colton talk about his sister, seeing the raw truth in his son's eyes, felt like a gift. It was a confirmation of everything he had preached, but never fully allowed himself to believe. It was as if God was speaking to him through Colton, giving him a glimpse of the divine plan, a reminder that even the smallest lives were part of something much greater. Over time, Colton's stories continued to unfold, each revelation more startling than the last. One day, while sitting on the couch with his father, he casually mentioned meeting a man who had told him how much he loved him. "He had big, strong hands," Colton said, "and he smiled a lot." Todd couldn't place who Colton might be talking about, so he asked for more details. Colton looked up, his eyes shining. "It was Jesus," he said simply. "He's really nice, Daddy. He loves everyone." Todd's heart skipped a beat. He had always taught his children about Jesus, but to hear his son speak of meeting him face to face was almost too much to comprehend. "What did Jesus look like?" Todd asked quietly, half afraid of what Colton might say. The boy paused, as if searching for the right words. "He had brown hair and a beard," he began. "And his eyes were like the ocean. They were full of love, like he knew everything about me, but still loved me anyway." Colton's description was simple, but profound. He talked about how Jesus wore a white robe with a purple sash, and that he had markers on his hands and feet. Todd felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew what Colton meant by markers. The scars from the crucifixion, the wounds from the nails. It was a detail that Colton couldn't have known, a piece of the story he was too young to fully understand. Yet he spoke about it with the confidence of someone who had seen it for himself. "What did Jesus say to you?" Todd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colton's expression turned serious, as if he was recalling something very important. "He told me it wasn't my time yet," he said. "He said I had to go back because he had work for me to do." The boy's voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that left Todd speechless. He pulled Colton into his arms, holding him close, as if he could protect him from the enormity of what he was saying. It felt like they were standing on sacred ground, teetering between the world they knew and something far beyond their comprehension. Sonia joined them, wrapping her arms around her husband and son. They sat there in silence, the three of them huddled together, trying to absorb the magnitude of what they were hearing. It was a moment that changed them forever. It was no longer just a story about a near-death experience. It was a message, a glimpse of heaven, and a reassurance that their faith was not in vain. For the Burpo family, it was the beginning of a new journey, one that would challenge their beliefs, deepen their faith, and set them on a path they never could have imagined. As Colton recovered, the Burpo family found themselves grappling with a flood of emotions. They were immensely grateful that Colton had survived, yet they were overwhelmed by the story he was telling them. It wasn't just the trauma of the emergency surgery and the close brush with death that left them shaken. It was the incredible, almost unbelievable details of what he described experiencing while unconscious. Todd and Sonia didn't know what to make of it. They had both grown up in the church, they had read the Bible countless times, and Todd had spent years preaching about heaven, the afterlife, and the love of Jesus. But hearing their son speak about meeting Jesus in heaven as if it were the most natural thing in the world, it left them stunned and searching for answers. In the weeks following Colton's release from the hospital, the story began to unfold piece by piece, often in the most casual moments. It wasn't as if Colton sat down to give a detailed account of everything he'd seen all at once. Instead, it emerged gradually, in snippets during breakfast, or while playing with his toys. One evening, as Todd was tucking Colton into bed, the little boy looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy," he said, "do you know how much Jesus loves the children?" Todd was caught off guard by the question, but he nodded. "Yes, buddy, I know," he replied. Colton's expression became even more serious. "No, Daddy," he insisted. "He really, really loves them. He told me." Colton spoke with the conviction of someone who had experienced a profound truth. He wasn't just repeating something he had been taught in Sunday school. It was as if he had come back with a message directly from Jesus, and he felt compelled to share it. Todd felt a wave of emotion he couldn't quite name. He had spent years preaching about Jesus' love, but it was different hearing it from his own child, who seemed to have been touched by that love in a way that went beyond words. It was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of the divine mystery that they could only glimpse through the veil of faith. Sonia was still trying to process everything as well. She found herself watching Colton more closely, listening intently whenever he brought up his experience. There was no hesitation in his voice, no sense that he was making up a story or embellishing details. He spoke with the kind of honesty only a child can have, as if he were simply describing a trip to the park. One afternoon, while they were sitting together on the porch, Sonia asked him gently, "Colton, what else did you see in heaven?" Colton's face lit up with a smile. "I saw lots of animals," he said excitedly. "There were all kinds of horses, and they had really bright colors. Jesus had a rainbow horse, Mommy." Sonia couldn't help but smile at the image of Jesus riding a rainbow-colored horse. It was such a childlike detail, so full of wonder and imagination, yet there was something about the way Colton said it that made her pause. He wasn't just talking about a dream or a fantasy. He was describing it as if he had seen it with his own eyes. As Colton's parents began to share his story with a few close friends, word started to spread. People in their church community were both fascinated and moved by what Colton was saying. Many of them had experienced loss or were struggling with doubts about their faith, and Colton's account of heaven gave them a sense of comfort and hope they hadn't felt in years. The idea that a young child, untouched by the cynicism of adulthood, had seen a glimpse of the afterlife and come back with a message of love and reassurance resonated deeply. But not everyone was ready to accept the story. Skepticism soon crept in, even among people who had known the Burpos for years. Some of Todd's fellow pastors listened politely, but seemed uncomfortable, as if they were trying to reconcile what Colton was saying with their own understanding of theology. Others suggested that perhaps it was just a vivid dream brought on by the anesthesia or a child's way of processing the trauma he had been through. One friend even hinted that it might be Colton's imagination running wild after hearing so many Bible stories. Todd struggled with these reactions. He understood the doubts, He had wrestled with his own skepticism at first, but he also knew his son. He knew the difference between a child making up a fanciful story and a child speaking from a place of deep, inexplicable truth. He couldn't dismiss what Colton was saying, even if part of him wanted to. It wasn't just the details that were striking. It was the way Colton's entire demeanor had changed. He seemed older, wiser in a way that went beyond his years. There was a calmness about him, a quiet certainty that Todd had never seen before. Eventually, Todd and Sonia realized they needed to share Colton's story more broadly. It wasn't about seeking attention or trying to convince anyone. It was about spreading the message that had been given to their son. They decided to write a book, though it was a daunting task. Todd had always been comfortable speaking in front of a congregation, but putting his family's most personal experiences into words for the world to see felt different. It required a level of vulnerability he hadn't expected. Still, they felt a deep sense of responsibility. They believed that Colton had been given this experience for a reason, and it was their duty to help him share it. The process of writing was both cathartic and challenging. As Todd and Sonia went through each part of the story, they found themselves reliving the trauma of nearly losing their son, as well as the incredible moments of revelation that followed. They laughed, they cried, and they prayed together as they pieced together the narrative. Colton, now a little older, was eager to help. He sat with his parents, offering corrections and adding details as they wrote. "No, Daddy," he would say, shaking his head. It wasn't like that. It was brighter. There was more light. When the book, titled Heaven is for Real, was finally published, the response was overwhelming. It quickly became a bestseller, resonating with readers across the country and beyond. People from all walks of life, devout Christians, agnostics, even those who had long given up on the idea of an afterlife, found themselves moved by the story. The simplicity of Colton's descriptions, the childlike wonder in his words, made it hard for people to dismiss. It wasn't a complex theological argument. It was a pure, unfiltered account from a little boy who said he had been to heaven and met Jesus. As the book's popularity grew, the Burpo family was invited to speak at churches, conferences, and community events. Colton, still just a young child, found himself standing in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, recounting his experience. He didn't seem nervous. Instead, he spoke with a quiet confidence that left audiences in awe. He would describe the colors, the animals, the angels singing, and the overwhelming sense of love he felt. People listened with tears streaming down their faces, some whispering prayers of thanks, others holding on to every word as if it were a lifeline. Not everyone believed, of course. There were skeptics at every event, people who came to challenge the story or dismiss it as a child's fantasy. But Colton didn't argue or try to convince them. He simply told his story, leaving it up to the listener to decide what to believe. Todd watched his son with a mixture of pride and amazement. Here was his little boy who had once clung to him in fear, now standing before strangers, sharing a message of hope and love that seemed to come from a place far beyond his own understanding. For many, hearing Colton speak was a transformative experience. People who had lost loved ones found comfort in his words, taking them as a sign that their departed were at peace in a place filled with light and love. It was as if a door had been opened, offering a glimpse into a world that most only dream of. Colton's simple, heartfelt testimony touched something deep within them, a universal longing for reassurance that death was not the end, but rather a continuation into a life more beautiful than they could imagine. As the events continued, the Burpos realized that their lives had been changed forever. They were no longer just a small-town family from Nebraska. They had become messengers of a story that seemed to transcend time and space. A story that carried with it a message of hope, faith, and the promise of something greater beyond this earthly life. The response to Colton's story grew exponentially after the publication of the book and the subsequent media coverage. What had started as a deeply personal, private family experience had become a phenomenon, capturing the attention of millions. For Todd and Sonia, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they were grateful for the overwhelming support and the many letters they received from people who had found solace in Colton's account. On the other hand, they found themselves facing a wave of skepticism and criticism that they hadn't fully anticipated. In the beginning, it was mostly friends and neighbors who reached out, offering words of encouragement. People from their church community shared how Colton's story had renewed their faith or helped them through a period of grief. One woman, who had recently lost her husband, told Sonia through tears that she finally felt at peace knowing that he might be in a place filled with light and love, as Colton had described. "I've been praying for a sign," she said softly, clutching the book to her chest. "Your son's words were exactly what I needed." But as the story spread beyond their small town, the reaction became more complicated. National media outlets picked up the story, featuring the Burpo family in interviews on major television networks. They were invited onto talk shows, where Todd and Sonia found themselves retelling the story again and again. Colton, still so young, sat beside his parents, quietly listening, chiming in when asked about specific details. He answered questions with the same innocent certainty, his eyes wide with sincerity as he spoke about Jesus and the angels. Yet, the more public the story became, the more it seemed to attract scrutiny. Skeptics began to voice their doubts, particularly in online forums and social media platforms. They questioned the authenticity of Colton's experience, suggesting that it could have been influenced by his upbringing in a devout Christian household. Of course he saw Jesus, some critics argued. That's all he's been taught since birth. It's just a child's imagination combined with the trauma of surgery. Others pointed to scientific explanations, citing studies on near-death experiences and the effects of anesthesia on the brain. They argued that Colton's visions could be attributed to hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation, rather than a genuine glimpse of the afterlife. Todd, who had spent years as a pastor preaching about the power of faith, found himself grappling with a new kind of challenge. He wasn't used to this level of public scrutiny. In his sermons, he had always emphasized the importance of personal testimony, the idea that each person's experience with God was unique and valid. But now, faced with a barrage of criticism from people who had never met his family, he struggled to find the right words. He felt a deep sense of protectiveness over Colton, who had shared his story with such innocence and trust, only to have it dissected and questioned by strangers. Sonia, too, felt the weight of the criticism. She had always been the more private of the two, less comfortable with the spotlight. In the quiet moments when it was just her and Todd, she confessed her fears. "What if people think we're making this up?" she would whisper, her voice filled with anxiety. "What if they think we're just trying to get attention?" Todd would hold her close, trying to reassure her, but he couldn't deny the knot of worry in his own chest. He had never intended for their story to become a spectacle. They had simply wanted to share the message they believed had been given to their son, a message of love, hope, and the reality of heaven. The skepticism wasn't limited to online forums. At public events, Todd began to notice a shift in the questions people asked. While many still approached with tears in their eyes, thanking them for sharing their story, others were more pointed, even confrontational. One man, at a book signing event, asked bluntly, "Don't you think it's possible that your son's visions were just a dream? Or that he's saying what you want to hear?" Todd was taken aback, but he tried to respond calmly. "I know my son," he said simply. "I've seen the way his eyes light up when he talks about what he saw. It's not something he learned from us. It's something he experienced." Despite Todd's attempts to address the skepticism with grace, the criticisms persisted. Some accused the family of exploiting Colton's story for financial gain, especially after the book became a bestseller. The publication had brought in more money than the Burpos had ever seen before, allowing them to pay off medical bills and make necessary repairs to their home. But the accusations stung. Todd had always prided himself on living a humble, honest life. The idea that people thought they were using their son's experience for profit cut him deeply. In the midst of the backlash, Colton remained largely unaware of the controversies swirling around him. He was still just a child, after all, more interested in playing with his friends and exploring the world around him than in debates about the afterlife. His innocence was a source of comfort to his parents, a reminder of why they had decided to share his story in the first place. He continued to speak about his experience with the same quiet certainty, unaffected by the opinions of strangers. For Colton, it wasn't a matter of belief or disbelief. It was simply what he had seen. One day, after a particularly difficult interview where the host had pressed Todd on the scientific explanations for near-death experiences, he returned home feeling exhausted and defeated. He found Colton in the backyard, playing with a toy truck. The sight of his son, so carefree and unburdened, brought tears to Todd's eyes. He walked over and knelt down beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm proud of you, buddy," he whispered. "You've been so brave." Colton looked up at his father, puzzled by the sudden show of emotion. "Why are you crying, Daddy?" he asked. Todd shook his head, wiping his eyes. "It's just, sometimes people don't understand," he said. "But that's okay, we know the truth, don't we?" Colton nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, Daddy," he said. "Jesus told me it's real. Heaven is real." The simplicity of his words cut through all of Todd's doubts and fears. In that moment, he realized that it didn't matter what other people thought. The skeptics could question, the critics could doubt, but it wouldn't change what Colton had seen and felt. It wouldn't change the peace that his story had brought to so many people who were struggling to hold on to their faith. As time went on, Todd and Sonia learned to navigate the mixed reactions with more ease. They stopped trying to convince everyone of the truth of Colton's experience and instead focused on sharing the message of hope that had come from it. They realized that their job wasn't to provide proof. It was simply to share their story and let people take from it what they needed. Some would find comfort, some would find doubt, and that was okay. Their role was to be the messengers, not the judges. The letters continued to pour in, many of them from parents who had lost children, thanking the Burpos for giving them a reason to believe that their little ones were safe and happy in heaven. Sonia kept a special box filled with these letters, reading them on the days when the criticism felt too heavy to bear. Each note was a reminder of the impact Colton's story was having, far beyond what they could see or measure. It was a testament to the power of a simple message told by a child, that there is something beyond this life, a place filled with light and love, where we are all held in the embrace of something greater than ourselves. For Todd, the experience became a lesson in humility and faith. He had started out wanting to defend his son's story against the skeptics, to prove its truth beyond a shadow of a doubt. But he realized that wasn't his role. He didn't need to fight every battle or convince every doubter. All he needed to do was keep sharing the story, trusting that it would reach the people who needed to hear it. He had always believed in the power of testimony, but now he understood it in a deeper way. It wasn't about being right. It was about offering hope. As the initial wave of skepticism began to die down, the Burpo family found a new sense of peace. They had weathered the storm of criticism and come out stronger on the other side. They knew there would always be people who doubted, just as there would always be people who believed. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was the story itself, the message that had been given to a little boy, and the lives it had touched along the way. The Burpo family was both relieved and exhausted as the initial rush of attention began to wane. The whirlwind of interviews, book signings, and speaking engagements had taken a toll on them, and they longed for the quiet simplicity of their life before Colton's extraordinary experience became public knowledge. Yet, despite the challenges, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They understood that sharing Colton's story had become a part of their lives now. A mission they hadn't anticipated, but had accepted with open hearts. As Colton grew, he became more articulate about his experience. He could explain his vision of heaven with even greater detail, filling in gaps and painting a vivid picture for those who listened. He described it as a place of overwhelming peace and beauty, far beyond what any words could capture. He said that everything in heaven seemed to be filled with light, not just illuminated by a sun, but glowing with an internal radiance that was almost musical in its harmony. He spoke of the flowers that never wilted, the trees that sang softly in the breeze, and the angels whose voices blended into a celestial chorus. It was a vision so bright and full of love that it brought comfort to countless people who heard him speak. As he continued to share his story publicly, the invitations only increased. Todd and Sonia had to make careful decisions about which events to attend, trying to balance the demands of their newfound role as storytellers with their responsibilities at home. Colton, who had once been a shy little boy, seemed to transform when he spoke about heaven. He stood in front of large crowds without a hint of fear, his voice steady and clear. He didn't use complicated language or grand gestures. Instead, he spoke with a simple honesty that disarmed even the most hardened skeptics. It was as if he were just chatting with a friend, recounting something he had seen on a school field trip. One of the most remarkable aspects of Colton's story was how it touched people across different faiths and backgrounds. The message he brought back wasn't wrapped in doctrine or theological debate. It was a message of universal love and the promise of a better place. At one event, a woman approached the family in tears, explaining that she had lost her son to a tragic accident the year before. "I've been so angry at God," she confessed. "I couldn't understand why he would take my boy away. But hearing Colton speak today, it feels like a small piece of my heart has been healed. I believe now that my son is safe and happy, just like Colton described." The woman's words left Todd speechless. He had seen many people respond emotionally to Colton's story, but each time it happened, it felt like a miracle. It was a reminder that they were part of something much larger than themselves. A story that had the power to reach into the deepest corners of human grief and offer a sliver of hope. Todd realized that this was the true gift they had been given. Not just the miracle of Colton's survival, but the chance to bring comfort to others in their darkest moments. Despite the positive impact, the skepticism never completely disappeared. In fact, it seemed to grow more sophisticated as the years went by. Colton's story became the subject of heated debates on radio shows, podcasts, and online forums. Critics dissected every detail, some accusing the family of fabricating the entire experience for fame and fortune. There were entire articles written about the psychological effects of near-death experiences, proposing complex neurological explanations for Colton's visions. They pointed to studies that suggested the brain, when deprived of oxygen, could produce vivid hallucinations that felt incredibly real to the person experiencing them. Sonia found these criticisms particularly difficult to handle. She was a mother, first and foremost, and her instinct was to protect her son from anything that might hurt him. She worried about how all this scrutiny might affect Colton as he got older. Would he start to doubt his own experience? Would he feel pressured to defend himself against the accusations of people who had never met him? In her quiet moments, she prayed for strength, asking God to guide them through this confusing, often painful journey. Colton, however, seemed unaffected by the noise of the outside world. He continued to live his life with the same childlike wonder he had always had, even as he grew into a teenager. He played sports, hung out with his friends, and loved spending time with his family. The story of his visit to heaven was a part of him, but it didn't define him entirely. He didn't walk around proclaiming it to everyone he met. Instead, he shared it when asked, with the same simple honesty he had shown as a little boy. It was a part of his life, but it wasn't the whole of it. As the years passed, the Burpo family began to settle back into a new kind of normal. They still received letters and invitations, but they learned to say no when they needed to, focusing on the life they had built together. Todd returned to his duties at the church, and Sonia continued her work with the local school. They found joy in the small, everyday moments: family dinners, movie nights, and trips to the lake. It was in these quiet, ordinary times that they felt the most grateful, a reminder of the miracle they had been given. One summer evening, as the sun set over their backyard, Todd and Colton sat together, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "Do you remember everything you saw in heaven?" Todd asked quietly, not wanting to push but curious if the memories had faded with time. Colton nodded, his eyes far away, as if he were looking back into a distant, beautiful place. "I remember," he said softly. "I remember the light, and how everything felt so warm and safe. And I remember Jesus." He looked at his father and smiled. "He was so kind, Daddy. He loved me so much." Todd felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard Colton say these words 100 times, but it still moved him, still filled him with a sense of awe. He realized then that Colton's story had never been about proving anything to anyone. It was about the love that his son had experienced, a love so pure and complete that it had left an indelible mark on him. It was about a child's simple, unshakable faith in the face of the most profound mysteries of life and death. For the Burpos, the journey was not about convincing the world that heaven existed. It was about sharing the gift they had been given, the small glimpse of something greater. It was about offering a message of hope to a world that so often felt dark and uncertain. They had learned that they couldn't control how people received their story. Some would believe, some would doubt, and that was okay. Their job was simply to be faithful to the message, to trust that it would find its way to those who needed it most. As they sat together, watching the last of the sunlight fade into the horizon, Todd put his arm around his son. They sat in silence, the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from a deep, unspoken understanding. They didn't need words to express what they were feeling. They both knew that they were part of something extraordinary, something that went beyond the limits of human understanding. And they knew that no matter what the future held, they would continue to share their story, one person at a time, trusting that the light Colton had seen in heaven was still shining, guiding them forward. In the end, that was all they needed: faith, love, and the unshakable belief that heaven is real.
Hi everyone, I've got an incredible story to share with you today, one that might completely change how you think about spirituality and faith. It's about Rich, Zachary Blackwood's Sadik, a young Christian whose life took an extraordinary turn when he encountered Jesus. You won't want to miss this. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments. And if you love Jesus as much as we do, make sure to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss inspiring content like this. Now let's get into it. In a shocking near-death experience, former gay man Zachary Blackwood uncovered a terrifying truth about life after death that forever changed him. What he witnessed will leave you absolutely speechless. I'm Zachary Blackwood, 47 years old, and I live in Burlington, Vermont. Before I tell you about my near-death experience, let me share a bit about who I was. I lived in a cozy 2-story house near Lake Champlain and worked as a graphic designer at a local advertising agency. I was openly gay and had been in a 3-year relationship with Marcus. The morning of my accident started like any other. I was driving to work in my Subaru Outback, sipping on my usual caramel macchiato. The fall colors were breathtaking and the crisp morning air was refreshing. I'd just finished a phone call with Marcus about our weekend plans when, out of nowhere, a massive moose appeared on Route 7. If you're from Vermont, you know moose accidents aren't rare, but nothing prepares you for the sheer terror of a 500-pound animal suddenly in your path. I swerved to avoid it, but at 65 miles per hour, my car spun out of control. The last thing I remember was my coffee cup flying through the air as my car tumbled down a steep cliff. The crash was catastrophic. My car slammed into several trees before coming to a halt in a ditch. The driver's side was completely crushed, and I was pinned between the seat and the steering wheel. I later learned that a passing truck driver spotted my taillights through the trees and called 911. The rescue was a nightmare. The steep slope made it nearly impossible for emergency workers to reach me. It took over an hour to free me from the wreckage. By that time, I had lost a significant amount of blood. I had 4 broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding, severe head trauma, and countless bruises. But what happened during that hour changed everything. Stay tuned, because what I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you know about life and death. The sound of rescue tools slicing through metal echoed around me, mingling with frantic voices shouting instructions. The helicopter blades roared overhead, cutting through the chaos. I was rushed to the University of Vermont Medical Center in Burlington. Later, the doctors told me something that still sends chills down my spine. I died twice in that helicopter, once for 3 minutes and again for 4. Marcus, my partner, was at work when he got the call. He rushed to the hospital, but by the time he arrived, I was already in emergency surgery. The doctors gave me a mere 20% chance of survival. It took multiple surgeries to stop the internal bleeding and repair the extensive damage to my organs. But what truly changed me forever happened during those minutes when my heart stopped. What I experienced wasn't like the peaceful, serene, near-death stories you often hear. It was vivid, raw, and utterly terrifying. Before this, I was content with my life. I had a successful career, a loving partner, and a comfortable lifestyle. Raised Catholic, I hadn't set foot in a church since high school. Religion wasn't something I thought I needed. I believed that if there was a God, He would accept me just as I was. But in those moments of clinical death, I saw how wrong I'd been. The experience shook me to my core, forcing me to confront truths I'd avoided my whole life. It didn't just challenge my beliefs, it completely redefined my understanding of existence. The moment my heart stopped, it was as if a switch had been flipped. It wasn't like falling asleep or fainting. It was instant and shockingly clear. I felt myself separate from my body, hovering above the helicopter. I could see the paramedics working desperately on my lifeless form below, but I felt strangely detached, as though watching a scene in a movie. Then it happened. A tunnel appeared, but not the comforting, warm light you often hear about. This was a swirling vortex, pulling me in with unimaginable force. The sensation was terrifying, like being sucked through a vacuum at impossible speeds. Colors I couldn't even describe swirled around me, and a deep, resonant hum vibrated through my entire being. As I hurtled through this tunnel, my entire life was laid bare before me, not as memories, but as a simultaneous experience of everything I had ever done. Every lie I had told, every person I had hurt, every selfish choice, it all had a weight, a crushing physical force that bore down on me. The most heart-wrenching part was seeing my relationships. I saw Marcus, but not in the loving, happy light I was used to. Instead, I saw the truth, the ways I had failed him, taken him for granted, and caused harm without even realizing it. What I had always justified as love was revealed to be something far more harmful, causing spiritual damage to both Marcus and me. Each intimate moment we shared appeared as dark, inky stains spreading through clear water, leaving an indelible mark on our souls. I was taken back to my childhood, to the time I first realized I was different from other boys. I remembered the confusion, the fear, and eventually, the defiance. I had pushed back against traditional values, rejecting the teachings of my early religious upbringing. But now, seeing it from this new perspective, I understood how each step away from those roots had led me further from the truth. The experience in the tunnel felt like it lasted for hours, though I'm sure it was only seconds in real time. Then suddenly, everything stopped. I found myself in a vast, indescribable space, not dark, not light, just an overwhelming presence of existence. And I wasn't alone. A being approached me. It had no physical form, yet I knew instantly who it was: Jesus Christ. The recognition wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply innate, like remembering something you've always known, but somehow forgotten. His presence was overwhelming, radiating pure, unconditional love, but also carrying a power and authority that made me want to fall to my knees. This wasn't the gentle, soft-spoken Jesus from Sunday school images. This was the King of Kings, the judge of all creation. In his presence, every excuse, every justification I had ever made for my choices dissolved into nothingness. I couldn't hide, not from him and not from myself. He didn't speak with words. Instead, his message came directly into my consciousness, a wave of understanding that was undeniable. He loved me more deeply and fiercely than I could have imagined. But that love wasn't an acceptance of all my choices. In that moment, I saw clearly how the life I had embraced, the identity I had built, was in direct opposition to his design. He showed me that my orientation itself wasn't the sin. It was the choice to act on it, to embrace it, to make it the core of who I was. I saw how these choices had rippled out to affect not only me, but also those around me. Every time I encouraged someone to be true to themselves by embracing the same path I had taken, I was, without realizing it, leading them away from the truth and from salvation. Then came the most difficult part. Jesus showed me others, countless souls who had made the same choices I had. They were in a place I can only describe as a holding space, not hell, but not heaven either. They were stuck, trapped in their own justifications and unwilling to accept the truth about their decisions. What struck me most was that many of these souls had been religious, even devout Christians. But their unwillingness to acknowledge the consequences of their choices had left them unable to move forward, caught in a limbo of their own making. I saw how many people, including myself, had interpreted Scripture in ways that justified their lifestyles instead of aligning with God's true design. This deliberate misinterpretation created a barrier between them and genuine salvation. Then, the presence of Jesus guided me to witness something that still sends chills through me. I saw glimpses of hell, not the cartoonish depiction of red devils and pitchforks, but something far more terrifying. It was a place of complete separation from God's love, where souls experienced the full consequences of their choices. In that moment, I understood that hell wasn't a punishment God created out of anger. It was the natural result of choosing to live permanently separated from Him. The souls I saw weren't there because God rejected them. They were there because, during their earthly lives, they had made choices that eternalized their separation from Him. What happened next was even more intense. Jesus began revealing the truth about sexuality and gender as He had designed them. I saw how the union of male and female wasn't just physical, it was a profound spiritual reality that reflected deep truths about God's relationship with humanity. From this divine perspective, I understood that modern society's embrace of alternative lifestyles wasn't progress, but a sophisticated deception. Every step away from traditional marriage and gender roles was a step away from divine truth. Then came a stark revelation. I was shown the spiritual impact of events like pride parades, gender transition surgeries, and same-sex marriages. While they appeared joyful and celebratory on the surface, I could now see the spiritual darkness that surrounded them. The most painful part was realizing the role I had played. Through my activism and advocacy for LGBTQ+ rights, I had unknowingly led others away from the path of salvation. Jesus showed me specific moments, conversations I'd had, social media posts I'd made, and young people I'd influenced. Each instance was like a heavy stone weighing on my soul. Yet, despite the weight of this realization, I didn't feel condemnation from Jesus. Instead, I felt an overwhelming love and a deep desire for me to understand the truth. His love was transformative, not punitive. He also showed me the struggles that many of my gay friends faced, struggles they hid behind outward appearances of pride and happiness. Beneath the surface, there was often pain, confusion, and a longing for something more. Finally, I was shown two possible futures for my life. In one, I continued on my current path, refusing to change, and ultimately faced eternal separation from God. In the other, I embraced the truth, left my gay lifestyle behind, and used my experience to help others find their way back to God. The contrast between the two was undeniable and heartbreaking. The realization was clear and unavoidable. Jesus showed me that my same-sex attractions weren't my fault. They were shaped by various experiences and influences in my life. But He also made it clear that how I chose to act on them was entirely my responsibility. He revealed that while these desires might not fully disappear in this lifetime, He would provide the strength to resist them. The most powerful moment came when I saw people who had successfully left the gay lifestyle. Their struggles had been immense, but the joy they experienced in following God's truth was even greater. I saw their crowns of victory in heaven, earned through their faithfulness and the difficult choices they made on earth. I came to a profound understanding. True love isn't about affirming every choice people make. It's about guiding them toward God's truth, even when that truth is hard or unpopular. At this point, the experience shifted. I found myself in what felt like a heavenly courtroom. But instead of being judged, I was being given a choice. I could return to earth with this new understanding, or I could face judgment for my unrepented sins right then. The weight of the decision was enormous. I knew that if I returned, my life would change completely. I would lose friends, face criticism, and have to leave Marcus, someone I deeply cared about. But staying would mean facing judgment for the life I had lived. Jesus showed me that returning to earth would serve a greater purpose. My experience could help others who felt trapped in the same lifestyle I had been living. He revealed how many people were secretly questioning their choices, but were too scared or confused to make a change. I was given a glimpse of the support system that would be there for me if I chose to return. Genuine Christians who would help me navigate this transformation, counselors who understood the spiritual aspects of sexuality, and even unexpected allies. The most moving part was seeing how my story could save others. Jesus showed me specific people, some I knew, others I hadn't met yet, whose eternal destinies could be changed by my testimony. Before making my decision, I was given one final vision. I saw myself speaking to large groups, sharing my story, and helping others find freedom from the gay lifestyle. I saw tears of joy as people found healing and restoration by embracing God's design for sexuality. But I also saw the cost. I saw myself being called names like bigot and traitor by the LGBTQ+ community. I saw former friends turning their backs on me, social media attacks, and even threats to my safety. Despite this, I also saw the profound peace that comes from living in truth. The choice became clear. With a mix of fear and determination, I chose to return. The moment I made this decision, an overwhelming sense of peace and purpose filled me, even though I knew the road ahead would be difficult. Just before returning to my body, I received one final message. My mission wasn't to condemn, but to love. My task was to guide others to the truth I had discovered, always with compassion and understanding, remembering that I, too, had once been blind to it. Waking up in the hospital felt like being born again. The physical pain was intense, but it was nothing compared to the spiritual awakening I had experienced. Marcus was by my bedside, holding my hand. But deep down, I knew things between us would never be the same. The first few weeks were the hardest. Explaining my experience to Marcus broke both our hearts. He thought my head trauma had... Marcus believed my experience was just a result of the head trauma, that I would come to my senses once I fully recovered. But I knew in my heart that what I had seen was real. I found a supportive church community and began the challenging journey of transformation. Some days were harder than others. The same-sex attractions didn't vanish overnight. But now, I had the strength and understanding to resist them, grounded in the truth I had learned. Word of my story spread quickly on social media. As I expected, the backlash from the LGBTQ+ community was intense. Former friends accused me of internalized homophobia and betrayal. Yet for every person who criticized me publicly, there was someone else who reached out privately. They shared their own doubts about the gay lifestyle and sought guidance. Today, 2 years later, I run a support group for individuals questioning their sexual identity or seeking to leave the LGBTQ+ lifestyle. It's not about forcing change or promoting conversion therapy. It's about offering love, truth, and support to those who choose to align with God's design. The accident that nearly ended my life was the very thing that saved it, not just mine, but the lives of countless others. Every week, I receive messages from people who have found hope and healing through my testimony. Some have chosen to leave the gay lifestyle, while others are still wrestling with their decisions. But all of them now know they are deeply loved by God. My near-death experience taught me that true love sometimes means sharing difficult truths. The eternal consequences are too important to stay silent. Yes, I lost my old life, but I gained something far greater, the peace and fulfillment of living in truth. My name is James Holloway from Bozeman, Montana. I was born and raised here, spending my entire life working on these lands. The date was November 10th, 2024. It was one of those cold, dry mornings typical of November. I got up early and went to the barn. The animals were their usual impatient selves, especially that stubborn, ornery bull. As I was feeding him, he suddenly turned and with startling speed, kicked me square in the chest. Describing the moment is hard. It felt as if the air was sucked out of my lungs. I couldn't breathe or utter a sound. My knees buckled beneath me, and I collapsed. My vision blurred, my ears rang, and my body disappeared into blackness. I awoke in a bottomless darkness. This wasn't just the absence of light. It was a suffocating, oppressive weight that pressed against me from all sides. It felt like I was entombed, trapped in an infinite grave. There was no sound, not even the echo of my own breath. The silence was deafening, filling me with an indescribable sense of isolation. I couldn't tell how long I stayed in that void. Time didn't seem to exist. The only thing I knew was the growing dread inside me. Something was approaching. Then, the silence shattered. Screams erupted around me, distant at first, faint whispers that soon swelled into an overwhelming cacophony. The voices were chaotic, filled with anguish and fury. Though I couldn't understand their words, I felt their torment and rage. Suddenly, flames erupted in front of me, small at first, then bursting into an inferno that tore through the darkness. These flames didn't just burn. They commanded my attention with a terrifying force. Through their flickering light, I began to see shapes writhing within. Were they human, or something else entirely? The figures grew clearer, their grotesquely distorted bodies twisted and stretched unnaturally. Their faces resembled humans, but were void of emotion. Eyes empty, mouths frozen in eternal screams. As one drew closer, I noticed its hands were nothing but skeletal remains, charred like blackened coal. Every movement they made resonated with a haunting hum that drilled into my mind. "You belong here," they said. Their voices were simultaneously soft whispers and deafening screams. The words echoed through the darkness, reverberating until they crushed me. Your heart was dark. As the flames rose higher, the figures became more vivid. Their faces reflected mine. One stepped closer, and its features morphed entirely into my own. Its hollow eyes stared at me with an anger that seemed to know every dark corner of my soul. It was as though I was confronting the most twisted, hidden parts of myself. Amidst the fire, warped structures began to emerge, shattered towers, cracked stones, and massive walls stretching endlessly. This place had no order, yet everything seemed connected in some inexplicable way. Chains dangled everywhere, some suspended in the void, others tethered to unseen anchors. The clanging of these chains was more than a sound. It was a physical blow, striking fear into my very core. The ground beneath me split open, revealing a massive chasm. From its depths, a beam of light shot upward, piercing the darkness. But this was no comforting light. It carried the echoes of lost souls, their cries embedded within it. I wanted to look away, but the light pulled me in, like a mirror reflecting every mistake, fear, and sin I had ever committed. Then I heard another scream, this time much closer. I turned to see a distorted figure crawling toward me. Its form was unrecognizable, but the pain emanating from it was palpable. As it dragged itself forward, its hands ignited with flames each time they struck the ground. From its lips came a single phrase, "There is no escape." As the flames climbed higher, I began to understand the true nature of this place. It wasn't just a location, it was a reflection of everything I had done, thought, and hidden in the darkest corners of my being. The figures in the flames became clearer, each one horrifyingly familiar. I realized they were manifestations of my own actions and choices. The darkness invaded my mind, and memories from my youth played out before me. These weren't mere recollections. They were as vivid and real as if I were reliving them. First, I saw a scene from my childhood neighborhood. I remembered when a new family, different from us in appearance and culture, moved in. I had joined the other kids in ostracizing them, playing cruel tricks to isolate them. But now, I wasn't just watching. I was feeling it. I felt the pain in their eyes, the quiet anger and fear they buried deep within. This place, this torment, forced me to confront the weight of every wrong I had ever justified, ignored, or forgotten. It stripped away every defense and excuse, leaving me naked before the truth of my actions. The words of the figure echoed in my mind. Your heart was dark. It was then I realized this wasn't punishment for the sake of pain. It was a reckoning. A voice echoed, cold and firm. Did you see their pain, James? I turned to find a shadowy figure approaching me. Its form was long and spectral, yet its eyes burned like fire. With every laugh, every joke, you pushed someone further away. What have you brought into this world? The figure asked. The tone wasn't accusatory. It carried the weight of undeniable truth. Another scene appeared before me. I was in high school, sitting in class. A memory played out of a joke I had made, targeting a classmate from a different ethnic background. Back then, everyone had laughed, and I'd felt superior. But now, as I watched, all I felt was a profound sorrow. I saw the humiliation and pain etched across that classmate's face. Their eyes spoke of the deep wounds my words had left behind. This is your legacy, the shadow said. Your words struck like stones. The darkness in your heart poisoned the world around you. Suddenly, the flames around me surged, and chains began appearing, one by one, wrapping tightly around me. Each chain was cold and heavy, but the pain they inflicted went far beyond the physical. Every chain represented a wrong I had committed. Jokes I made at Marcus's expense at work, the harm I caused without realizing it, the cruel words I spoke just for my amusement. All of it bore down on me as the weight of my actions manifested in those chains. Then, Marcus's face emerged from the shadows. At first, it was obscured by darkness, but gradually it became clear. His eyes were filled with tears as he looked at me, a mixture of anger and profound disappointment etched into his features. Your words left me carrying a burden I should never have had to bear, he said, his voice trembling. Why, James? Why did you make me live in a world you taught me to hate? I wanted to speak, to apologize, but no words came out. I tried to fall to my knees in repentance, but the chains held me in place, pinning me to the ground. There is no escape from this, James, one of the figures said. You've built your own hell, and only true repentance can break it. But repentance isn't just a feeling. Will it lead to change? At that moment, a mirror-like surface appeared amidst the flames. I gazed into it and saw myself, but it wasn't the person I thought I knew. My face was darkened, my eyes hollow and lifeless. This was a reflection of hatred and selfishness. I wanted to turn away, but the mirror held me captive. A sudden scream tore through the air, so raw and piercing that it shook me to my core. I looked down and saw a twisted figure crawling toward me, its body writhing in agony with every movement. Flames engulfed it as it inched closer, its scorched hands clawing at the ground, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and it whispered, "Will you live like this forever?" Desperation filled me. I summoned what little strength I had and whispered, "Forgive me." The words were faint, but they echoed and grew louder. "Forgive me," I cried out, for the first time feeling the weight of genuine remorse. This remorse wasn't a fleeting emotion. It was a consuming fire, burning through the darkness within me. These flames didn't scorch my surroundings. They purified the shadows in my soul. When I opened my eyes, I couldn't immediately understand where I was. The ceiling, the dim light, familiar faces, all blurred together. Slowly, my awareness returned, and I realized I was in the village doctor's office. A deep ache radiated from my chest, as if I could still feel the bull's kick. But the pain that lingered strongest wasn't in my chest, it was in my spirit. The doctor was at my side. "James, you've finally woken up," he said, relief and concern mingling on his face. "We almost lost you. You've been unconscious for days." Days? My time in that hellish realm felt like an eternity. I wanted to tell the doctor what I had experienced, but the words stuck in my throat. The darkness, the screams, the fire, the grotesque faces. It was all so vivid, yet impossible to articulate. I took a deep breath and said nothing. I didn't have the strength to process it all. Quietly, I whispered to myself, there must be a reason for this. That hell wasn't just a place to inflict pain. It was a lesson, a reckoning. I needed to change, but how? As questions gnawed at my mind, an internal struggle began to unfold. In the days that followed, the visions clung to me like a shadow. Feeding the animals, completing chores, everything felt like a hollow routine. An indescribable void weighed on me, yet it also seemed to push me towards something greater. Each morning, as I looked at the sky, I asked, have you given me another chance? If I were to find an answer, I knew I had to face these questions head-on. One morning, I decided to visit the church in town. I'd rarely gone before. My faith had always been superficial, but that day, I felt an undeniable urge to turn to God. Pushing open the wooden doors, I was greeted by the stillness of the stone walls. The silence echoed like a balm and a weight, all at once. I knelt down, my prayers more like deep sighs than words. You saved me, I thought. But why? I'm afraid of staying the same man I've always been. Change me. Make me new. I stayed there for what felt like hours. The peace I found within the church eased some of the burden of my experience in hell. Yet, as I left, something outside caught my eye. A flyer on the church bulletin board. It read, Marcus Carter, Auto Repair Service. Below was an address and phone number. My breath caught in my chest. Marcus was here. After all these years, without thinking, I got into my truck and drove to the address. When I arrived, I saw Marcus working among a few cars. He wore an old cap, his hands greasy. He was the same Marcus I remembered. When he looked up and saw me, his face froze, his expression unreadable. I stepped out of the truck, my heart pounding. The burden I had carried for so long now consumed me entirely. Marcus, I said, my voice trembling, will you listen to me? At that moment, Marcus put down his tools and looked me straight in the eye. James Holloway, he said, my name carrying both curiosity and years of buried anger. I considered dropping to my knees, but instead stuffed my hands into my pockets and pressed on. I came here to apologize for those days, for everything I put you through, for the words I said. I was wrong, completely wrong. I hurt you, I excluded you, and it's taken me far too long to realize how deeply wrong I was. If there's any chance, I ask for your forgiveness. I want to change. Marcus looked at me, his gaze steady. The silence that followed felt endless, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Finally, he exhaled deeply. James, I've waited years to hear that, he said. It hasn't been easy, but I forgive you. We all make mistakes, and it seems like you had to take a journey to see yours. Tears welled up in my eyes. Marcus placed a firm hand on my shoulder, squeezing it tightly, and in his eyes, I saw a warmth I hadn't expected. The weight I'd carried for so many years lifted, if only a little, in that moment. As I left the repair shop that day, I felt like both Marcus and God had given me another chance. This new journey was only beginning, but I had taken the first step, a life dedicated to God, filled with love and forgiveness. That was the path ahead. Today, I've fully devoted my life to God. My work on the farm remains the same. I wake up early to tend to the animals, work the fields, and care for the land. But as I go about my day, my mind and heart are entirely different. I'm not just a man working the land anymore. I'm a loving neighbor, a forgiving father, and a servant trying to spread God's light. As I return to this life, I've realized that I'm not just growing crops on this soil. I'm cultivating a new person within myself, guided by God's love. Marcus and I are now closer than ever. I frequently visit his repair shop, where we share coffee and reminisce about the past. His warmth and his capacity to forgive constantly remind me of God's mercy. This second chance was made possible through Marcus's forgiveness and God's grace. I can't say I've completely left my past behind because I don't want to forget the dark experience I lived through. Every morning as I pray, I recall what I saw that day. It reminds me of who I was, where I've come from, and where I want to go. That darkness led me to God's light. My life has been rewritten by His love, and I now know I'll never walk this journey alone. Every morning, a verse comes to mind as I pray. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. And my prayer goes like this. God, I am grateful for this second chance you've given me. You've turned the darkness in my heart into light and taught me forgiveness, love, and compassion. Today, I vow to treat my past as a lesson and my future as a service under your light. Thank you for listening to me.